Copyright University of Auckland, all rights reserved. The content and delivery of lectures in this course are protected by copyright. Material belonging to others may have been used in these lectures and copied by and solely for the educational purposes of the university under licence. You may record the lectures for the purposes of private study or research, but you may not sell, alter or further reproduce or distribute any part of these lectures to any other person. Failure to comply with the terms of this warning may expose you to legal action for copyright infringement by the copyright owner and/or disciplinary action by the university.
Can we just get the checking over?
Do you want to change it to the digital one now? Yeah. Absolutely, yeah, that's fine.
Because otherwise no one will ever say it.
That's fine. That's totally fine. So you want this on?
Yeah.
And I can call you Anthony to help me. Anthony, could you just help me make sure that this is playing okay? And on loop?
Jet blaster was manufactured by pouring a liquid gypsum
And how do I make it sound good and look all good? So I might just leave it to it, okay? Thank you.
before being pressed. The top or base wire has to be as smooth as possible to be seamlessly connected with the decorative materials like
So we won't run it now. She will put the Phil Twyford one back up. And then Nicole will introduce it. Nicole will speak for a minute. She'll introduce us. We'll all watch it for 2 minutes. And then we'll put the Phil Twyford one back up. So that's in the background. So, yeah. So, playing Mike's always yeah.
quite soft, actually.
Hey. Oh, what the hell?
Is it very...
You know what's happened? I think one of the mics was really pushing up against the gate. Just turn it right down. Sweet. So there you go, eh? Pretty rare.
Yeah. Everything's sweet as. So the only thing you have to do is... he's going to introduce the first speaker. It's a lady in the red.
Yeah.
She's only going to speak for like a couple of minutes. But then once she's finished speaking,
Yeah.
there is...
I'm going to change that.
Yeah, this guy here. There's actually a video. Here's it.
Is it a file?
Yeah. I'll just leave it out.
Play it from the start.
Oh, sweet. Okay, so do you want to get full screen as well?
The usual.
Yeah, okay. So
they're going to play the video, and then afterwards, would they prefer to have that back on?
yeah, it's exactly amazing. Now I don't know where the speaker, the speaker is in Ireland. I don't know where he is, and it's unsure whether he wants to. This is because this is quite loud, so I reckon people can actually hear me talking now.
Yeah.
So he might not even need it. He might want it. So you pull it out. This year I'm going to go to. So here's your volume here. So there's your two so if someone starts talking,
Turn yourself down.
Leave it like this after the event, or go back to
did you want to do one of these?
Yeah, sure, that'd be great.
Are you going to move around?
Oh, not a lot, but probably a bit.
Yeah, okay. Right, so, I would.
Cool.
So that one here has
one.
it's quite high. It's not sounding good.
I don't hear any feedback. Do I need to find something?
Sure. And then I'll introduce you properly. You're okay. So I think most of you have been here before. Thank you again for coming again. The focus of our series is on doing the NDC well in Auckland, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. But first I'd like to thank our sponsors, JIP, who are generously supporting this series. Without JIP, this series wouldn't happen. So I'd just like to welcome Nicole Stock to come up and say a few words, and then we'll have a little brief video, and then I'll introduce our guest.
Thanks, Phil. Thanks everyone for coming, and it's such a pleasure to be here with the Honourable Phil Twyford. And we are so pleased and proud to be a sponsor of the Class Standard series, and we have now been for a number of years. And I think that's indicative of how we see ourselves as a partner to the building industry, and it is about sponsoring and supporting events like this, but it's also about helping find practical solutions which are going to help solve your issues and help with efficiency and productivity and a whole bunch of those things which this government is really trying to solve. And this series, which is focused on medium density and multi-unit, is particularly close to our heart at the moment, and we've done a lot of work around that space. A couple of specific things which we're working on just at the moment. We know how much documentation and RFIs and things that councils are asking of you at the moment. And so to that end, we're just about to release a new fire book, so that's going to be coming out mid-October. And so that should offer some good guidance and some more systems and support in that area. This is also a very fragmented industry, as you know, and so we are actually really proud of our scale and how we can actually be real thought leaders in this space and offer that consistency and best practice. And so to that end, we've got the new JIP site guide, which is coming out in just a couple of weeks. So that's a huge, valuable resource for councils and for architects and for builders, and we're really proud to come out with that shortly. And I'm sure Phil will talk a lot about prefabrication. Now, what we have been doing for a number of years already is working very closely with prefab manufacturers, offering a free service to do the testing on acoustics and fire and bracing and things like that, and we continue to do so because prefabrication is going to be hopefully a big part of how we improve productivity in this space, and so we really just want to be supporting that because prefab has a number of challenges and technical stuff should not be what's holding it back. And of course, we're made here, and we're really proud of the fact that we are manufactured here, and we have been for 90 years. So that's New Zealand jobs, New Zealand factories, and New Zealand engineers, and that's really, really good. So we're just going to play a very, very quick video, so you can see how something as simple, or what people assume is a simple plasterboard, how complex it actually is, and the precision and things that are involved. So thank you all for coming.
JIP plasterboard is manufactured by pouring a liquid gypsum mixture onto a piece of liner paper, then placing another piece of liner paper on top before being pressed, smoothed, cut into various lengths and widths, and dried. The paper liner is specially produced to withstand the soaking and drying of the manufacturing process. The inner or back ply provides a strong bond to the gypsum core. The top or face ply has to be as smooth as possible to be seamlessly compatible with decorative materials like paint and wallpaper. The board making process starts with reels of paper liners loaded onto the paper stands, fed onto the conveyor belt and filled with the mixed plaster slurry. The plaster mixing is continuous, blending the gypsum with water and additives to ensure that the plaster slurry flows quickly and can be levelled out by the static forming plate which controls board thickness. The board is formed face down. The endless plasterboard sheet expands slightly as it hardens while moving down the line. By the time it reaches the rotary knife, the plaster is set enough to be cut before entering the dryer. The dryer is over 100 metres long with multiple decks and zones. The line speed and temperature in each zone can vary depending on the weight of the plasterboard. The production line is electronically monitored, and any slight flaw in the surface or core is picked up, and that board is automatically removed, ensuring the highest quality finish and performance levels. When completely dry, boards are automatically released, and to minimise damage during transportation and handling, are placed face to face and taped together. When a certain number of sheets have been loaded onto the table, they're packed together for transport. Full packs are transferred to the distribution warehouse where they are stored by type and length. Windstone Wallboards manufactures a wide range of commercial lengths of standard and specialty boards. Custom lengths of popular plasterboards between 2.4 and 6 metres are available for orders over 100 sheets. House lot orders are popular in modern residential construction, saving time and money at the building site. As well as plaster to be made into plasterboard, Windstone Wallboards manufactures a range of compounds for jointing plasterboard. Additives are mixed in with the plaster to impart the properties required for specific applications. Windstone Wallboards also produces and markets specialist plasters for craft and dentistry. To find out more about Windstone Wallboards' range of jib products and services, request copies of our literature, or for a no-obligation chat with the jib technical advisors about your particular needs, call our jib helpline.
So I'd like to introduce our guest tonight, the highlight of our Fast Forward series. We keep calling him Phil, but he's actually the Minister of Housing, Urban Design and Urban Development and Transport. So Auckland is not the only city in the country. It's not the only place in the country that's facing issues. Just on Radio New Zealand yesterday, I was hearing about rental issues in the Bay of Islands. So it's not just about building houses. It's not just about putting roofs over people's heads. It's about building communities. And it's not just about racing before the next election to get points on the board and saying that you've built houses. It's about doing them well. It's about building quality, so we're not building problems for ourselves further down the track. So there's a great deal to talk about tonight. The good news is that the Minister will be talking for about half an hour, and then there'll be plenty of time for questions. So feel free not to interject while he's speaking, because I will make sure that you get the opportunity to ask your question or even make your statement if it doesn't have a question mark at the end. And also the Minister we're having drinks and nibbles afterwards, and then the Minister will be hungry and possibly thirsty as well, and be available to talk to afterwards. So please welcome the highlight of our Fast Forward series, the Minister of Housing, Urban Development and Transport, Phil Twyford.
Thank you, Bill, for that very gracious introduction. I want to acknowledge the Creative Arts and Industries faculty and also thank JIB for supporting this series, which is apparently very popular. It's a real pleasure for me to have a chance to talk about the issues that I feel so strongly about and that our government places such a high priority on in a joined-up way, I hope, with an audience that I know understands and cares about these issues. I live in a community that was built almost entirely for young families to get a start in life. Good quality, affordable, but modest starter homes by government that believed that it was the job of government to stimulate the market to build affordable homes and to give generation after generation of young New Zealanders the opportunity to own their own homes. This community was built with all of the things that communities need: schools, shops, churches, playing fields, sports clubs, open spaces, a community centre. This isn't a fantasy. It's actually how we did things in the 50s and 60s, even in the 70s. The community I live is Te Atatu Peninsula, or Te Atatu North as it was known. And you can imagine, in that other era, on a Saturday morning, men out there helping each other lay their concrete driveways. And then on the next day, getting together to lay the foundations for the kindy or the football club rooms. Barefoot kids playing spaceys in the dairy, and if you haven't seen Oscar Kitely's short film, Tom's Dairy, have a look. It captures the moment perfectly. The local cop, a guy named Ross Dallow, who's now in retirement, knew all of the criminal families intimately. And whenever there was a crime committed, he would just go and visit the families. And he tells those stories today. It is a strong community, and it has had such an intense sense of pride and identity that the second generation have been, for some time, moving back into that community to raise their kids there because it means something to them to live there. Now, my point is not nostalgia for the sake of it. My point is that the current plague of problems that afflict our built environment, our housing market, our urban transport systems, they are not ordained by God. They're not symptoms of success, as the old government was so fond of telling us. They are the toxic legacy of decades of failed policies. But we can change them. Previous generations fixed these problems, and somehow we unlearned most of it in the 1980s. And there are many, many cities and countries around the world who either don't have these problems or they've fixed them. Now, this might seem an odd thing to do, to preach to an audience of architecture and planning and design people. But the first thing I think we have to do is bring a strong dose of economics to this problem. Governments and councils, those that are entrusted to regulate the built environment, have for too long ignored the basic rules of economics, and the results have been disastrous. Policymakers have been content to ignore the demand forces that have made our housing market in Auckland over the last 2 decades resemble a Ponzi scheme. Tax settings have been like giant signs beside the motorway saying to young New Zealanders, if you want to make $1, invest in residential rental property. That's what it says to them. So our view is that if we want to get a handle on this whole thing and turn it around and build a more productive and stable housing market that can give people the kind of housing that they want at prices they can afford, then we have to address those demand settings. And that's why we are changing the law to shut down negative gearing tax breaks that allow property investors to run rental properties at a loss and offset those losses against other taxable income. It's why we've changed the law so that offshore speculators can't invest in our existing housing stock simply to farm the capital gain. We want foreign direct investment into new developments and new building, but we don't want to put our tiny little real estate market into a global market where you're competing with people on the other side of the world with very deep pockets. It's why we've mandated Sir Michael Cullen and the Tax Working Group to design a tax system for New Zealand that's not only fair and makes everyone pay their fair share, but it tilts the playing field away from real estate speculation towards the productive economy that generates jobs and exports. So that's the first thing I wanted to say. The demand side is important. Don't believe these kind of single issue people who just say it's all about supply, or it's all about this. It's actually about a whole lot of things, and we cannot ignore the demand side of the equation. Supply, of course, is important, and that's why we are now using the balance sheet of government to stimulate those affordable homes that the market hasn't been building. Only 5% of new builds over the last decade have been in the lower quartile, the more affordable quarter of the market. A generation ago, 30 years ago, it was about a third of new builds were affordable. That's one of the reasons why home ownership rates have been plummeting. The share of under 40-year-olds who own their own home has dropped by 50% since the early 90s. And it's when house prices doubled and then doubled again in Auckland, it's pretty easy to see why that happened. So with Kiwibuild, we've got a number of channels, a number of ways that we're delivering it, but essentially we're working with private developers and builders to build affordable homes. And we are ramping that up so that in this current year we're going to build 1,000. We've had 42,000 people sign up on the website because they want to know what's happening with Kiwibuild. And this Sunday we're going to be taking journalists through the very first Kiwibuild homes so they can see what they're like. In the second year we'll build 5,000, in the third 10,000, 12,000 a year after that, and through to 2028. If you think Kiwibuild's too ambitious, in the 1970s, Sweden built 1 million affordable homes in a decade. 1 million. So maybe Kiwibuild's not ambitious enough. We're also going to increase supply by building more state housing. We utterly rejected the philosophy of the old government who thought that state housing was sort of some archaic thing from the 1930s and we should just get someone else to do it, desperately wanting iwi to buy them and run them, or charities, and then ended up trying to hock off state houses to Australian investors and PPP companies from the UK. We reject that. In our view, state housing is a tradition we should be proud of in this country. It's how for generations we've given people a start in life who would otherwise struggle to get a decent roof over their heads in the private rental market. And we're committed to massively increasing the supply of state housing and modernising state housing. We've restored Housing New Zealand's social mandate to be a good landlord. When I became the Housing Minister, I found out that there were Housing New Zealand staff who were doing pastoral care work on the weekends because they'd been told not to do it in working hours. So we're building more state housing. Housing New Zealand is growing, it's doing that pastoral care work, and we're going to make it a really great 21st century public housing landlord. We're doing other things that we think will increase the supply of housing. And we can build more state houses, we can build Kiwibuild houses, but if we're going to be successful in the long term, we need the market to produce better results as well. And so we're tackling two things that we think stop the market from responding to demand. There's no shortage of demand or need for housing in Auckland. We've had a population shock, a massive increase of population, but the housing market hasn't responded to that demand. And there's a couple of things that have been holding it back. One is infrastructure financing. It might sound a bit arcane to say, well, you know, we're trying to solve the housing crisis here, why are you going on about infrastructure financing? But the difficulties that councils and developers have in accessing the finance to build the infrastructure that allows you to build more houses is one of the main roadblocks that have stopped our city from growing. The developers are often small, undercapitalised. It's hard for them to borrow. The banks won't lend to them. Councils like Auckland Council are already right up against their debt limits. They can't borrow anymore. And so we're looking at a system that will allow us to tap in using infrastructure bonds to bond finance long-term debt for urban infrastructure that will then be serviced by an infrastructure charge on the properties and the developments that benefit from the infrastructure. And it's drawing on elements of systems that are very, very successful in the US. We're not picking it off the shelf, but we're taking the basic elements and developing it into what I hope will be a new system for financing the infrastructure for urban growth. We also want to make our planning system more responsive to demand. And the planning system that we have kind of inherited is one that tries to stop growth at every turn. That's a bit rough, but the effect is true, I think. We've had a system up until recently, up until the unitary plan, we had a draconian system that stopped us growing up as a city and stopped us growing out. Now, when you add the population shock that we've had, that creates a pressure cooker, and that's why we have this amazingly expensive urban land in Auckland. So we need a planning system that allows our city to grow. And in Auckland, the big imperative is that we do density well and that we do more of it. I don't know if you heard on the news this afternoon, but an apartment block on Dominion Road that would have delivered over 100 units, 100 apartments, was rejected by Auckland Council planning commissioners because it would have jeopardised a turn-of-the-century dairy. So we need to allow our city to grow. And in many ways, a lot of the problems we've got all come down to a failure to allow and encourage and manage that growth properly. All right, enough supply and demand. You'll be very pleased to know that the dismal science does not have all the answers to our big urban issues and to the housing crisis. Design has a huge part to play. Attention to the quality of our urban environment, our homes and our neighbourhoods is critical, and importantly, innovation in the way that we build offers, I think, many of the solutions that we're looking for. We so need to improve the quality of our housing stock. I don't know if you saw a story on the Herald website, and it's on Checkpoint tonight. It's a rental property in Papakura. It's the Swamp House. There's a small lake underneath the house filled with rubbish. And the family who rent that property got 2 young kids. They're constantly sick. And when the Herald reporter contacted the landlord, he referred the Herald reporter to his lawyer. We need to overhaul and change the rules for renting in this country. And you will have seen in the last few days that I released a package of proposed reforms that will change the way 1/3 of the country who are renters changes the way they live. Renting's now a mainstream part of Kiwi life, but our tenancy laws are antiquated. The typical tenancy in New Zealand is less than 12 months. And in a rising housing market, the like of which we've had in Auckland for much of the last couple of decades, and also in other parts of the country, has seen landlords cashing in on rising capital gain. That's great from an investment point of view. And the economic commentators and the business pages of the Herald are going, the housing market's going gangbusters. Well, it's pretty bloody miserable for families who, in communities that I represent in West Auckland, who for the last few years have been moving once or twice a year. And that keeps people poor. It's expensive to move. If you're a renter or you've flatted for a part of your life, you'll know how expensive it is. Letting fees for a start, although we're about to get rid of them. But removal costs, all of the costs of moving, really take it out of people. Not to mention the costs of transients, of kids being moved from pillar to post, from one school to another. I have low decile schools in my electorate. The entire school roll, primary school roll, not the entire, 50% of the roll will turn over in a given year. And a large part of that is housing stress. It's parents looking desperately for somewhere where they can stay and somewhere that's affordable. So we're going to change the rules around renting that will give renters more security of tenure, that will extend the notice periods. I want us to get rid of these 90-day no-cause terminations where a landlord can terminate a tenancy for no reason at all. That's one of the reasons why, that rule is one of the reasons why renters are very reluctant to raise problems or to complain or to ask for something to be repaired. So over the next 2 months, we're going to be publicly consulting on those reforms. It's very similar. The package we've put out is quite similar to proposals that the state government of Victoria is currently turning into legislation. Scotland and Ireland have done very similar reform exercises to this in recent years. So the other thing about the renting experience is the quality of the homes. So I just don't think we can go on any longer as a country where it's okay for a landlord to rent out a property that is a risk to the health of the people who live in it. There's a reason that 1,600 older New Zealanders die premature deaths every winter. It's called excess winter mortality. It's because of cold, damp homes and people who cannot afford or won't turn on the heater. Now, in the Northern European countries and Scandinavian countries that are much, much more ferocious winters than we have, they don't even have excess winter mortality. The mortality rate's flat right through the winter, whereas ours goes like this. So we've got to do something about it. The second bit of legislation that we passed on becoming the government was the Healthy Homes Guarantee Act. And next week I'm releasing a draft set of standards that will require insulation. I'm proposing to the standard of the 2008 Building Act, much better than what's in the existing legislation, that will require a fixed, modern, affordable heating source in every rental property. And will set standards for drainage, so we don't get this sort of swamp house, Papakura situation happening, and draft stopping and ventilation. And if we do those things, if we set decent standards for those things, it will ensure that every rental property is able to be maintained in a warm, dry state. That's our goal. Design is obviously much more than ensuring that homes are kind of functional and warm and dry. And I'm inspired by the success of the massive state house building program that the first Labor government undertook in the 1930s and 40s. And they were building at that point, at its peak, about 10,000 homes a year, which is what we're aiming to do with Kiwibuild, by the way. And that was a deliberate, concerted effort by that government to improve the quality of housing stock, to have well-designed homes with fresh air and sunlight and places for kids to play. And I think there's an opportunity now in the 21st century to make a similar leap forward and to use not only things like the Healthy Homes Guarantee Act to lift standards in the rental market, but to use the government procurement that we're doing through Kiwibuild and through the State House Build program to raise the standards. Standards of thermal efficiency, good standards of just good architecture and good design, of natural ventilation, of good urban design, the spaces between the homes, to create streets and neighbourhoods that will build stronger communities. I think it's a fantastic opportunity We're currently working on how we can set design standards for Kiwibuild that will not only lift the standard of thermal efficiency, but also use principles of universal design so that people of all ages, from babies through to people in their 90s and 100s, can live happily in those homes. Wouldn't that be a good thing? This is a fantastic opportunity. We've never had it before because the construction industry has always been so fragmented, small companies doing small amounts of work. We've never been able to get the benefits of economies of scale and set standards. And the other, I think, really exciting opportunity that comes from a mass government procurement program like Kiwibuild is that we can contract the building of these homes to companies that have scale. People that can, instead of, most houses in this country are built by firms with only 2 or 3 workers who build, a handful of homes a year. It's the classic, a couple of guys and a dog and a ute out in the weather for months on end. So we do want to use off-site manufacturing. Why should the Scandinavians have all the fun? Let's use digital technology. Let's use production line manufacturing approaches and build houses in factories. Better quality homes, well designed, well made, and then put them up on site in days. And Fletchers have done a very exciting thing with this panelisation factory in South Auckland, and there are other companies who are doing the same. Housing New Zealand's made massive strides in the last 18 months, contracting work to a small number of suppliers who can deliver the volume and the quality. And they're using off-site manufacturing already and driving down build costs and driving up quality and reducing the time. The average time for Housing New Zealand to go from go to woe is 14 to 18 months. That's been reduced to 4 to 5 months using better supply chain management, more off-site manufacturing. Now imagine if we apply those same logic of scale and efficiency right across Kiwibuild and the public housing program. So our government's just about to begin a kind of a formal conversation with off-site manufacturing companies and investors, both here and overseas, to talk about how we can establish a large-scale off-site manufacturing industry here in New Zealand. And my dream is that we will take timber that we grow in New Zealand. We're really good at growing Pinus radiata, and at the moment we just ship off raw logs so that we ship all the jobs and the intellectual property and everything else with those logs. How about we take that timber and we turn it into high-value engineered building products like CLT, and we make really good quality homes that everybody can afford in factories and create hundreds or thousands of jobs here doing that, and then build an export industry out of it. Wouldn't that be good? I wanted to come back to my Te Aratu example that I used in the beginning, because I think that we also have to rethink the way, not just the detail of design and insulation and so on, the close detail, but we have to rethink the big canvas as well. And so we've been doing a lot of thinking about how we can change the way our cities grow and develop and change the shape of our cities. And drawing on that Te Aratu example, think about how we can build whole communities, not just houses, not just streets, not just subdivisions, but whole communities. One of the challenges is that, our cities mostly have grown based on this 1950s model of urban development, based on allowing the kind of suburbs to just incrementally radiate out from the centre and building a few roads and motorways. We can't carry on like that. In Auckland, we can't, because the distances are too big. We have to crack this question, this challenge of second-generation urban growth. There's a reason people will go and buy a home an hour's drive down the motorway, away from the jobs, away from the amenity, away from all of the delights of the central city. There's a reason. They can't afford anything else. So we need to build affordable homes in places where people want to live. And so what that means in a city of Auckland size is density. The very essence of the city is density. And I feel like we've been on this halting, rather painful journey in recent years. We all know that there are examples of density that we hate in the city, but there are also some really great examples. There are some people doing some wonderfully creative things, designing great buildings. The thing that I really don't understand about density in our current discourse is that most of us, when we go to Sydney or Melbourne, we love the density that we see. It's part of the urban experience. And yet, the kind of density that we're contemplating in Auckland right now is what Sydney's had for 50 years. So we're in a process of change. I think that the unitary plan was a really positive and incremental step forward in freeing up those heightened density rules. But we need to go, in my view, a lot further. We've got to allow our city to grow up. And but one of the other big barriers to intensification and development in brown and greyfields locations is the sheer complexity of it. You have multiple landowners, fragmentation of title, infrastructure issues, very complex, in fact far too complex for the private sector to deal with on its own. Our response to that is to create an urban development authority, a public agency with all the powers and the tools that currently only local government has, tooled up to lead these large-scale complex projects, to do the infrastructure, the master planning, to think about the need for open space and amenity and all the things that communities need, to engineer the kind of mix of housing types and styles and affordability that people need, and then to work with the private sector to design and build and sell great places for people to live in and to work in. So we are currently about to, I think, finally sign off the last bit of policy work on the Urban Development Authority. I hope to have legislation in the Parliament by the end of the year, and by the end of next year I hope we'll have the UDA up and running. And our vision is to have 12 or 15 large-scale urban development projects in Auckland running simultaneously, and others in Wellington and Hamilton and Tauranga and whoever else wants them. And we recently purchased nearly 30 hectares of land at the Unitec campus on Carrington Road. And Unitec has kind of retreated back into a smaller footprint, and we're going to build a new urban community around it. And we want it to be a showcase of great urban design. It's got the most unbelievably good transport connections. It's going to have light rail at the Point Chev end and heavy rail at the Mount Albert end. It's got walking and cycling paths on all sides, and right next to the Waterview motorway interchange. So it's an opportunity to build a kind of post-car dependent urban community. And I expect that we'll have car sharing there, that people won't automatically have to pay for a car park when they buy an apartment there. They can choose to lease one if they want, but they won't have to purchase that up front. And there'll be great walking, cycling, car sharing services, and of course amazing public transport. It's got the most beautiful community gardens. It's got a beautiful marae. And this gorgeous stream that runs alongside that block there. So we want to build a contemporary urban community there that does justice to what an amazing site it is. And there will be a lot more. The other really big conceptual shift in our approach to housing and urban development has been to integrate transport thinking into the shaping of our cities. And so I said before that the big imperative in Auckland is that is quality intensification. Well, what we know is that transport shapes our cities. And we'd be mad to bring thousands and thousands of people into these urban communities without putting in place the transport infrastructure to support them. Why change the habits of a lifetime, I hear you ask? This is the way we've always done it in New Zealand. Allow growth to happen, subject people to decades of misery, and then expensively retrofit the transport infrastructure 2 decades later. I know that's the way we've always done it, but it's time for a change. So that's why we have placed such a priority on building out the rapid transit network in our city. We already have a rapid transit network. We've got a spectacularly successful northern busway that now brings more people across the bridge every morning than travel in private car. And we have a heavy rail network that once the city rail link is completed, is going to allow trains to go through dozens of our urban town centres as frequently as every 10 minutes. And yesterday I was down in the hole. It was me, Grant Robertson, and Mayor Phil Goff and Deputy Mayor Bill Cashmore, 4 white men standing in a hole with hard hats on. It was a fantastic media opportunity. And, but it's an amazing piece of engineering, and it's going to double the capacity of the rail network. It's a fantastic investment. And what we're going to do, we, meaning the government and Auckland Council, is that we're going to build light rail to supplement that rapid transit network. So 2 lines from the city out to Mangere, connecting 2 of the biggest concentrations of jobs in the country, and providing high quality rapid transit for all those communities across the isthmus and in a big swathe of South Auckland. And we're also going to build light rail from the city out alongside State Highway 16, serving my beloved West Auckland, which is one of the worst served areas in the city for public transport, and then out into the northern growth corridor, up into Kumeu and Huapai, where there's all those thousands and thousands of jobs and houses going into that area, currently without decent transport infrastructure. Now, the reason that we've chosen to build light rail is that light rail all over the world is an amazingly effective magnet for investment and urban renewal. It's as much an urban development project as it is about rapid transit. And so it's partly the permanence of the tracks. An investor thinks, yep, those tracks aren't going anywhere. I'm going to spend $50 million and build a beautiful block of apartments right next to the light rail line. The other thing that makes light rail so attractive and so successful in this way is that it creates a wonderful pedestrian-friendly urban streetscape that people love to live in, to shop in, to go to cafes and restaurants, and to have offices and service industries and all the rest of it. So that's, and what we're going to do is we're going to use the Urban Development Authority through that entire corridor, like let's say an 800-metre radius of a walkable radius of the stations along the way, which effectively create an urban development zone. And the Urban Development Authority's job will be to get the best urban development outcomes possible from the huge increase in amenity that will result from the light rail line. It's also, as well as the City to Mangere line, is going to go up Dominion Road, already one of our kind of priceless urban communities. And then through Roskell and Mangere, 2 of the biggest concentrations of public housing that we have. And so we're going to use that as an opportunity to redevelop those communities and build more houses, build modern houses, warm, dry homes, look after the public realm, bring good urban design, build affordable Kiwibuild homes and homes to be sold on the open market. And in doing so, this is a way that we can not only build all these Kiwibuild homes and state housing, but actually create really fantastic modern urban communities. Let me talk about walking and cycling, because I think this is a really important part of this picture. Walking and cycling used to be seen as something, I don't know, for hippies or fitness freaks or whatever. But it's been, I think, a real sea change in the way we think about our cities these days, here and internationally. That walking in a civilised city, a livable city, and therefore a successful city, is one that is walkable and bikeable. People want it. It's an alternative to sitting in traffic. It's a way to get fit, to be happy. Cycling has amazing public health benefits, as does public transport. And the interesting thing is that cycling infrastructure typically has an economic value measured as a benefit-cost ratio 3 to 4 times better than your typical road project. So it makes sense on all sorts of ways. That's why we announced last week spending $390 million on walking and cycling infrastructure in the next 3 years around the country. And the government's going to fully fund the Sky Path, a walking and cycling pathway across the Harbour Bridge. So we're finally going to reverse the mistake that was made back in the late 50s when the government of the day, the national government, of course it had to be, cut the budget for the Auckland Harbour Bridge, not only cut the extra lanes off that meant we had to have clip-ons within a decade, but cut the walking and cycling option off. And I think it will be an amazing project for our city that will be a big breakthrough about walking and cycling. Commuters will use it, people just wanting recreation and fitness will use it, and it'll be something that we take all our overseas visitors and out-of-town visitors to do, because it will be such a beautiful experience. The last point I wanted to make before I wrap up was that, as you can see from what I've been saying, we're doing a lot. And we're doing a lot of things differently. We're thinking about cities differently. We're thinking about the way central and local government work together. We're investing differently. We're trying to work with the market better in a more intelligent way. We're thinking about design differently. But government doesn't currently have much of the capability that we need to do this, because we just haven't been operating like this. The last government had 3 different housing ministers. And so how could you possibly have a joined-up grip on what's going on in housing? So we're currently not only establishing this Urban Development Authority to take a kind of a helicopter view of urban growth and urban development, but we're also creating a new Ministry of Housing and Urban Development. So if any of you have aspirations to be in the public service, here's your opportunity. There's going to be lots of jobs going. So we're bringing together the capability that currently is scattered across 3 or 4 different ministries and agencies into one Ministry of Housing and Urban Development. We're bringing together all the housing bits, and then we're going to grow the urban development capacity, because that just doesn't exist anywhere. And that's, I think, one of the most important parts. The really final thing I wanted to say is that for me and for Labour, all of this is fundamentally a social justice issue. It's about fairness. Because what we have now is desperately unfair. We're in the 3rd winter of the worst homelessness that anybody can remember. And I don't need to give you the statistics, but it's all the images, because you know them. I talked about home ownership rates before. The way our housing market has been allowed to operate has had the effect of making a massive transfer of wealth from my son's generation to my generation. It's totally unfair. The opportunities that my generation and my parents' generation took for granted are completely closed off to Gen X and Gen Y. The housing crisis and the way we have failed to manage housing is the biggest driver of poverty and inequality in New Zealand today. So we have to change it. And there isn't one thing to do. There's a whole lot of things to do, and they all kind of interact. And we've got to be willing to drive reform on a whole number of different fronts and have the political courage to see it through and make those changes. But we're going to do it. And I hope, as people who care and understand and love design and the built environment. I hope you'll work with us to do it. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. So now we've got time for about 15 minutes of questions, and because I can, I'm going to ask the first question. And my concern about urban design authorities is because they were also suggested by the previous government. Urban design authorities, now I'm a great believer that we need them so that we can utilise brownfield land, and we can use the same mechanisms that we've got for, say, driving a motorway through a part of town that I used to live in, Waterview, but we can use them for that. The difference between urban design authorities as they were mooted under the last government here and ones that operate overseas is that urban design authorities overseas have much more of a design focus, and they were funded to achieve the work. And the big danger here is that we don't use that Public Works Act mechanism to turn it acquire land and then turn it over to Fletcher's or Todd, and then whatever you may think of what they do, and we end up with little two-storey subdivisions. So what would your response to that be?
So I'm committed to us working better with the private sector. Government doesn't have all the answers. There's a huge amount of talent and creativity out in the development community that we want to harness, and we want to work better. And I hope that as we are gearing up government to be much more muscular in this area, I hope that the private sector will see the opportunities and gear up as well. So companies like Jasmax, for example, are really moving into the space and doing some exciting things. So, and I hope, and there are a bunch more as well. So, and we need big developers like Todd and Fletcher's and others. We need them because we need a really good, capable and creative private sector. We need companies that aren't fly-by-night, that can build a balance sheet that can sustain large projects. We need companies that care about what their reputation will be in 50 years' time and are committed to building great things. So this is very much about the state learning to work better with the market to get good outcomes. But the design piece is critical. We've got to set standards. We want good design. We want good urban design. I'm absolutely committed to setting what I call public good outcomes. I am not interested in our government helping development projects that don't include affordable housing and state housing. You know, when John Key was elected, one of the first things he did was he took the state housing out of Hobsonville because they didn't want working class people to have a property with a view of the sea. And I thought that was scandalous. And I'm interested in us building inclusive, strong communities. We need to build more affordable housing and more state housing. If we don't do it, who will? The private sector won't do it on its own because they don't make the margins on it. So we'll set those standards both for design and for affordability. We're going to use these big projects as opportunities to bring in the likes of the Salvation Army to do like clusters of housing for older people, the Housing Foundation to do assisted home ownership programs, and get the diversity of housing that the community and the public sector can deliver, but the private sector on its own won't.
Thanks. So, questions?
I have a question about two legislative things. One is, I've read through the discussion document with regard to residential tenancies, and I'm disappointed that nothing about property managers is included, which I very much think needs to be included. The second question has to do with the Unit Titles Act. Sad to say, we were on the verge of some needed amendments to the Unit Titles Act under the last government, and I don't hear anything more because those amendments could help buyers of apartments feel more sure about what was going to go on once they were an owner?
So on the question of property managers, I'm getting a lot of lobbying about that right now, and there's been a lot of publicity out there that that would make you think that probably it's overdue to regulate property managers. I've sort of set out for you this evening a massive reform agenda. We are doing a lot of things, and I'm not averse to the idea of regulating property managers. There are arguments on both sides about whether we should do it. I can't do that right now because we have so much other work on, but we may get to it. In relation to the Unit Titles Act, I totally agree that if density done well is an important part of our future, then we need to update the Unit Titles Act to reflect that. And I'm expecting to have legislation before the Parliament next year that will make the changes that you're looking for, that will modernise body corporates and unit titles. So, stick with us. Yeah.
Next question over here.
Hi, thank you for coming along this evening. I heard a lot of things I liked. I'm a planner who works for Auckland Council, so listen to your comments with interest. I'd like to say, as a planner, we're only as good as the legislative framework that we operate in. So with regards to stopping the city growing up and out, I imagine the problem is, you have to balance adverse effects of on persons with development. So the adverse effects might be shading or dominance. And with regards to Dominion Road, the adverse effects in this case were Dominion Valley Heritage Overlay. So again, it's a balancing adverse effects with development, and that's what the legislation requires us to do.
Yep.
So we're only as good as the legislative framework in which we operate. So the question is, are there any plans to reform the legislation?
Well, our view generally is that if we got rid of the RMA tomorrow, we would have to invent something pretty similar. It's a legislative framework for making decisions on land use regulation that ensure access to justice. And the diagnosis that David Parker, the Minister of the Environment, and I share on this is that most of the problems with the planning system in relation to urban development can't be sheeted home to the RMA, but they can be blamed on the way that councils have made their plans and their consenting decisions, and the lack of national guidance that successive governments have given them. Now, the way that the RMA was written was that the government of the day would provide national guidance through things like national policy statements and national planning standards and so on matters of the national interest, or matters that were kind of beyond the ambit of local government. And that's been the big omission. And so we've started work on a project that will lead to a national policy statement on quality intensification that will give councils parameters for their planning and consenting that will have the effect of incentivising high quality intensification. And so that's kind of where we're at. I'm not saying the RMA doesn't need any work, and actually David Parker does have quite a work program underway that's designed to de-smith the RMA and to make it more agile and less complicated and cumbersome and expensive.
Another question.
Kia ora, Minister. It's quite an interesting kōrero that you gave us. So I work across housing projects, have done some stuff with HRC, TRC and private developers, and more recently, as an example, the Chinese developers that brought Tamaki Park City, Tamaki campus. I've also worked with NZTA and Auckland Transport on the Southern Corridor and Amiti, so I'm pretty familiar with what's kind of going on in my hood. I'm a child of Tāmaki, and I'm really active, and just want to ensure, you know, that what's best for the people is also better for the whenua. I grew up at a time when capitalisation on family benefits was a thing back in the 50s and 60s. Fortunate that my parents had their own home, and at the age of 30 they gave me a deposit to buy my own home. It's now an opportunity for me to put 5 houses on that particular section out in Papakura, and also want to acknowledge that whānau that you're talking about, who I extended a room in my house for them to come and stay with me until they get that stuff sorted. So I guess the issues that I'm kind of grappling with at the moment is the opportunity to develop my own whānau papakainga, and the issues that come with the policies around papakainga and marae definition and stuff like that. And so I am working with the Auckland Council on those things. I just wanted to also pick up on your kōrero about Sweden. You know, it's not really a good example because we don't have Swiss bank accounts here. And also the fact that I have a friend who did a presentation on co-housing and cooperatives, and we don't do it as well as they do. And we also don't provide 40% interest or less. So maybe we need some Swiss bank accounts. So I guess for me, you know, we talk about being able to utilise the policies that are in the unitary plan, but policies are only good as those that are making the decisions. So when we look at consider the technical advisory groups that sit around in these various entities, the urban design panel, and no disrespect to any individual, but you know, sometimes we're still stuck in the old hood, and so density, in terms of density with height as opposed to breadth, is something that people really need to get their heads around, and we need to move on from that old model that you talked about in the 50s. So I guess for me, there's a whole lot more hui that needs to happen, and we need some real good leaders, movers and shakers in that space. Kia ora.
Thank you.
Kia ora. I'm not sure if there was a question there, but the thing that I took out of that was the need for ongoing consultation. Because in Auckland there are a whole bunch of people who are worried about increasing density and whether they'll be left behind, whether there's something for that in there.
You talked about Tāmaki, and it reminded me that one of the things that's been taxing me recently is when we do all of this, the kind of urban regeneration at scale, as we want to, there are huge social justice issues. The property market on its own is a brutally effective sorting mechanism that sorts people according to wealth, and it doesn't need government to help it to do that any more efficiently. The great danger of urban regeneration projects is that they simply drive up property values and drive out people who've lived there, low-income families. And so I'm determined that as we do these developments, that we ensure that these communities continue to be places of opportunity for people, that there is affordable housing in those communities, that there is more state housing, that we give the people, the families who live in those communities, first crack at the Kiwibuild affordable homes for home ownership, and we use things like shared equity to help them do that. That we ensure that the jobs and the training from these huge construction programs go to the people in those communities, and that we involve the local community from go to woe in the process of design and redevelopment. And I don't want all of this effort to have the effect of being a kind of state-backed gentrification program. That would be the opposite of what we want to achieve.
Another question here, and we've got time for another couple after that if you want to put your hands up. So.
Yeah, thank you for that. I share your vision, all right, and I think a lot of people do here as well. What I'd like to share with you is I was on the Housing New Zealand board in 2003, and I put got very involved, and I decided about the middle of 2003 that this country needed 40,000 state houses, not affordable houses, by 2013. Now, that's just talking about state houses. That didn't happen, all right, under the current government at that time. The Treasury put the kibosh on it. They said that there was too much, the market in Auckland was too heated, and therefore it couldn't possibly happen. Now, I saw that as the most amazing statement for a government to take advice from, and I hear everything you're saying. I think this is totally underscaled, because if you hear what I'm saying, we weren't even getting past the 8 ball in 2013 building 40,000 state houses. That's not even talking about. Now, listening to your figures, we're not even going to get past year go by about year 7. Now, that's what your scale of your problem is, and I'm not laying that on you. It's on this country, as you said, right? And that's why I think, you know, you're doing the right thing. You're starting slowly and moving into it, but it has to scale up much faster, and it has to be going. We can't wait till 2028, right? And it's as simple as that. So this design community has to be right behind you and has to be creative managing it for you, because that's what it's going to take. Right.
Thank you.
Not sure if you want to respond, but we can move on to the next one. Always good if a question has a question mark at the end.
Or even an upswing in the tone at the end of the sentence.
We do have another question at the
Thank you, Minister, for sharing with us your insights. I've heard you talk about prefab and also UDA. I think it's perhaps fair to say that a good and regulated prefab system is bottom-up friendly by reducing risk and cost of construction and hopefully reducing the time for consent, etc. Perhaps the segregated private sector, once empowered by this regulated prefab system, will be better suited to reflect the true community demand and also be better poised to produce a variety of outcomes. Would you say that rather than the traditional top-down UDA approach, would there be any potential conflict going forward between these two schools of thoughts? Also, would you say that the significance of UDA represents more of an iron-fist approach for enabling work such as utility and access, but not really the design outcome, because that might be better tackled by individual builders?
That's a really interesting question. So I take in basically, as you will have heard tonight, I consider these issues to be fundamentally moral and ethical issues. And I take a very eclectic political and sort of technical approach to the solutions. And so I find solutions that I think, and look for solutions both from the left and the right that work. And you can see those in our policy program. And I'm open to top-down and bottom-up solutions. So you could see the UDA as a top-down solution, like a big, powerful governmental agency. But actually, second-generation urban growth is so bloody complex and risky and uncertain, you can't do it without some pretty powerful machinery to cut through the red tape and the vested interests around urban development. So that's why you need quite a powerful organisation to do that. And what we're doing with the UDA is that we're putting central government into a space that hitherto has been the sole domain of local government. Local government has demonstrated that it can't do this stuff. It can't or it won't. And part of the reason it won't do it is that local government is so close to the vested interests and the local NIMBYist forces that don't want development. And you saw that in the unitary plan process. When the final stages of that plan-making process happened just prior to the local government elections, and those poor councillors and local board members, they were running for the hills. You know, they stared into the abyss of NIMBYism. And that's a really graphic illustration of why local government can't do this stuff. It needs mates. It needs central government to be alongside it, saying, yep, we're going to do this development. We're going to build affordable houses. We're going to build density. Because if we don't, our kids will never be able to afford to live in this town. And that's why we've got to put central government in the space. Not to take over, but to work with and alongside local government and the private sector and community to do these things. I think there are things that we can learn from other jurisdictions about the bottom-up approach to development. So Tokyo is one of my favourite cities for urban form. And they had a renaissance there where they deliberately set out to change their planning system. And they allow, unlike our system in Tokyo, they allow people to build, you know, pretty much what they want. And it's a fantastic city. Their housing is much more affordable than ours relative to local incomes, much more. They've never had in the last 30 years a shortage of housing in Tokyo. And it's a really interesting, organic and diverse kind of urban form that I think is, from a design perspective, there's good and there's bad, but basically it's an exciting and stimulating and pleasing city to be in, Tokyo. Now, there's a guy called Brendan Hare. I don't know if you follow him on Twitter. He blogs and writes about urban development and cities. And he's come up with some really interesting ideas about how we could make it easier and incentivise landowners at the local level, at the streets, at the block level, to get together with other landowners and redevelop their blocks to build more density. And I think if you're interested, have a look at Brendan's stuff on Twitter, because I think there could be some really interesting bottom-up things that we could do that would help grow the missing middle of medium density in our city.
That's a key point.
Sorry, I did have a question, but I don't know about the upswing and the tonation of the end of my question. So, and talking about bottom up, so, and you talked about shared equity and rent to own. So in my situation where we're trying to develop this papakainga, I'm just one person. If we think about the those policies, I guess, that Housing Foundation have around shared equity and rent to own, is there an opportunity or thinking from yourself around how the government can help those whānau that have a quarter-acre section and just want to put a couple of houses on the back for their family to be able to, you know, adopt those kinds of facilities around shared equity and rent to own? Kia ora.
So two things there. I think that we should be trying to find ways to encourage the sort of Vancouver-style gentle density by making it easier for people to put additional dwellings on their properties. And on shared equity, we're doing a lot of work at the moment on how we can either have a government or a government-private partnership that would grow shared equity programs that would allow a much bigger group of people to benefit from Kiwibuild than otherwise would be the case, because we know that a $400,000 and $500,000 mortgage, while it's very small by market standards in a place like Auckland, it's still unaffordable for a lot of people. And a shared equity program is one way that we can really grow the pool of people who could realistically take on affordable home ownership. And particularly with Māori and Pacifica families who are disproportionately in the lower income brackets, if we don't do something like shared equity, they are really going to struggle to get their fair share of the benefits of Kiwibuild.
And we have our last question, but we do, just reminding everyone that we've got drinks and nibbles after this, and the opportunity, although it may well have been the Minister's driver phoning me there,
No.
But we will have the opportunity to have a chat with the Minister outside afterwards. So.
Neville Patterson, I'm a consulting engineer, work by myself. If you're talking about the problems with the RMA, one problem you really...
Can you hear at the back?
It's not necessarily the RMA, but the processes that generate, that evolve to council to do their business. For example, if you want to subdivide a house, even just 2 houses on a section that are already on the section, you've got to submit 5 applications, submit the same plan 5 times to be checked by 5 different engineers, and wait for it all to be done. And it's supposed to be done all in sequence, and then you have to get it all signed off at the other end, and then public drainage and stuff like that. And you've got Water Care and Auckland Stormwater, and they don't talk to each other. They developed their own systems. Well, Auckland Stormwater's got their own system, or the old system, and Water Care has got a completely different system. It's entirely different people, different places, different offices, different email addresses, and different manuals, and they're hundreds of pages long. And it all used to be together as Auckland Council, and that's where the drains are vested in, and they're just doing an empire building, really. And if you want to see a problem, how long it takes to get these things through on a tiddly little subdivision, you know, something to tidy up that would be much appreciated.
Tomorrow. It's early days.
Again, there was no question mark at the
Actually, I would like to respond to that, Bill. So I agree that's a huge problem. The resource consenting and building consenting is too bureaucratic, too slow, too costly, and it acts as a brake on the entire system. And I look at a place like Queensland, who have much, much better, more affordable housing than we do. They have more urban growth, more development. Part of it's that they're more aggressive about investing in infrastructure, but they have a consenting and a land use regulatory system that is much more customer focused. It actually encourages development. And my colleague Jenny Salesa, who's the Minister of Building and Construction, she's leading this work, and we've got some things underway. I totally accept it's a problem. One of the sort of underlying factors is that the reason councils are so risk averse and careful is that they carry a lot of the liability, and they've come out of a sort of 2 decades of the aftermath of the leaky buildings catastrophe. And one of the bits of work that we're doing is looking at how we can reallocate the liability away from councils to the builder or the developer as the supplier and the homeowner as the customer. And one of the ways that's kind of demonstrated of doing this in other jurisdictions is having mandatory home warranties. So that if you buy a new home, you have to buy this warranty that provides you with a, let's say a 30-year guarantee to remedy all defects. That has to be backed by insurance, right? So you're paying for the insurance policy. You've got to pay for it. And the thing there is that the builder, the shonky builders that are such a feature of life in Auckland, the cowboy builders, they won't get insurance. They won't get insurance cover. So ultimately it would kind of weed them out. But I think that's one of the underlying drivers of this incredibly bureaucratic and risk-averse approach that councils take to consenting.
Auckland drainage is right down the middle. It's a completely separate organisation.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. Yeah.
I take your point as well. We own a 450 square metre section, and there's a 5 metre by 5 metre square giant concrete structure on that. No one knows who owns it. So, and that's encroaching on the footprint for us to add another house. So I need to talk to a decent architect. So,
does anybody know one?
There's a few. So anyway, if we could just thank the Minister.
Thank you.
And now the beer and the wine's getting a bit tepid, so I'd encourage you to go outside and enjoy it while it's still setting cool. There's been no walk. That was horrible.
you going to stay and have a drink?
Is it off? That's so weird. Someone turn this off. No, it's on. Oh, there we go.